She fell from the wagon into Cottonwood Creek with nothing but a dead man's secrets and 6 weeks of running behind her. The water should have killed her. It nearly did. But 3 pairs of amber eyes found her in that current, and 3 pairs of hands pulled her from the cold. They were brothers, mountain men, and they had no idea that saving her life was about to cost them everything they had built. This is the story of Clara Whitmore and the 3 men who refused to let her drown. 3 rivers, 1 heart. The wagon wheel struck the boulder with the sound of a cannon shot, and Clara Whitmore felt the world tilt sideways beneath her. For 1 frozen heartbeat, she was airborne. The reins tore from her fingers. The sky and the earth traded places, and then the water swallowed her whole. Cottonwood Creek in spring was not a gentle thing. Fed by snowmelt from the high peaks of the Wind River range, it ran fast and cold and merciless through the Wyoming Territory, carving its path between granite shoulders and fallen timber with the kind of fury that respected nothing, least of all a 22-year-old woman from Boston who had never learned to swim in anything rougher than a bathtub. The cold hit Clara like a fist to the chest. Every muscle in her body seized at once, her lungs locking tight against the shock, her mouth opening in a gas wab that pulled frigid water across her tongue and down her throat. The current took her, immediately spinning her like a rag doll over slick stones and submerged branches, her navy blue traveling dress ballooning around her legs before the fabric drank its fill and became an anchor, dragging her down toward the rocky bottom with terrible patient weight. She clawed for the surface. Her fingers found air once, twice, and each time the creek yanked her back under with the indifference of something that had been doing this long before people arrived and would continue long after they were gone. Through the roar of water in her ears, she heard her own thoughts with strange clarity. This is how I die. Not in Boston, where the men who killed father might have found me eventually. Not on the trail where I spent 6 weeks looking over my shoulder. Here, in a nameless creek. Alone. Her shoulder struck a submerged log, and the pain was bright and immediate, cutting through the numbness of the cold. She reached for the log with desperate fingers, but the current was faster, peeling her away and sending her tumbling toward a bend in the creek where the water narrowed and deepened, and the sound became a sustained roar. Then she heard voices, 3 of them, deep and loud and coming from somewhere above the water's chaos. A hand closed around the collar of her dress with a grip so powerful it tore the fabric where it met the stitching. Clara felt herself hauled upward against the current water, streaming from her hair and her clothes, and a second arm hooked beneath her back to support the weight of her waterlogged skirts. From the bank, a third voice shouted directions over the noise of the creek, sharp and clear, and accustomed to giving orders in difficult situations. Her head broke the surface. She coughed violently, expelling creek water from her lungs in great heaving spasms that racked her whole body. Hands were pulling her, lifting her, carrying her toward the grassy bank with a strength that seemed impossible given the force of the current. When Clara's vision cleared enough to see the men who had saved her life, she thought for one disoriented moment that she was seeing triple. 3 men stood on the creek bank, tall, broad-shouldered, built like the mountains themselves, each one well over 6 feet with the same strong jaw, the same high cheekbones, the same piercing amber eyes that caught the last copper light of the setting on and held it. Brothers, clearly, perhaps even more than brothers. There was something in their shared features that spoke of a bond deeper than mere family resemblance, something forged in fire and tempered by years of relying on no one but each other. The one who had pulled her from the water was the tallest of the 3 and the most still. He stood with creek water dripping from his denim trousers and leather boots, his chest rising and falling with the exertion of fighting the current, but his face was composed, controlled. His amber eyes moved across Clara with the quick, thorough assessment of a man trained to evaluate threats and injuries in a single glance. There was a small scar above his left eyebrow, a thin white line that pulled the skin slightly when he narrowed his gaze. He did not look like a man who smiled often or easily. "You are not drowning," he said. His voice was deep and low, carrying the kind of quiet authority that did not need volume to command attention. "Not here. Not today." The second brother stood a pace behind, wringing water from the sleeves of a dark brown leather vest he wore open over a work shirt. He was leaner than the first, but no less powerful, with a coiled tension in his body that reminded Clara of a barn cat watching a mouse hole. His expression was caught between suspicion and reluctant concern, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking between Clara and the destroyed wagon upstream, as though calculating the trouble she represented. "That wagon is done for," he said to the tall brother. "Could not fix it with a blacksmith and a prayer." The third brother had already wrapped his own coat around Clara's trembling shoulders before she could protest. He was the youngest of the three, clean-shaven, where his brothers wore stubble with slightly longer hair that curled behind his ears. His smile was wishy and warm, and arrived on his face as naturally as sunrise, though Clara noticed that his eyes, the same amber as his brothers, never stopped moving across the tree line and the ridges above the creek. Habit, she would learn later. The habit of men who had survived things that most people only read about in newspapers. "Welcome to Wyoming, Ma," the young one said. "Heck of an entrance." Clara coughed again, tasting creek water and blood where she had bitten her tongue during the fall. She was shivering so violently that her teeth rattled, her soaked dress clinging to her body like a second skin of ice. Every instinct told her to be afraid of these three enormous strangers standing over her in the fading light of a wilderness she did not know. But the coat around her shoulders was warm and smelled of wood smoke and pine sap, and the hand that had pulled her from the creek had not hesitated for even a fraction of a second. Before we go any further with Clara's story, if you are new here, take a moment and hit that subscribe button. I share new frontier stories every week, and I would love to have you along for the ride. Drop a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. Now let us get back to Clara and those three brothers on the bank of Cottonwood Creek. The tall brother, the one who had spoken first, extended his hand to her. His palm was calloused and scarred, the hand of a man who had spent years working with tools and weapons and rope and reins, and when Clara placed her own small hand in his, she felt the controlled strength in his grip. He pulled her to her feet as easily as if she weighed no more than a sack of flour. "Name is Silas Vance," he said. "These are my brothers, Colton, Boone." He indicated each with a slight movement of his head. "We have a cabin about a mile from here. You need dry clothes and a fire before hypothermia sets in." Clara looked back upstream at her wagon, tilted at a sickening angle, where Cottonwood Creek had caught it, one wheel shattered into kindling, the contents of her life scattered along the bank and bobbing in the current. Everything she owned, her clothes, her money, most of it, the supplies she had purchased in Denver for the final leg of her journey to Laramie. "Everything I own," she whispered, and the words came out hollow, emptied of everything except the exhaustion that had been building for 6 weeks across 2,000 miles of running. Boone, the youngest, had already been moving along the creek bank while his brothers talked. He returned now carrying a leather satchel and a small trunk, both dripping wet but intact. "Pulled these out before the current took them downstream," he said. "Could not get much else without going for another swim, and I have had my fill of cold water for today." Clara took the satchel with hands that trembled from more than just the cold. Inside it, wrapped in oilskin that her father had prepared with his usual meticulous care, were the two objects that had cost Alistair Whitmore his life and sent his daughter fleeing across half a continent. A leather-bound journal filled with precise geological notations in her father's small, careful handwriting, and a map hand-drawn on heavy paper marking the location of what 3 summers of survey work had confirmed to be one of the richest silver deposits in the Wyoming Territory. "Thank you," Clara said to Boone, clutching the satchel against her chest. The relief was so intense it almost buckled her knees. Everything else could be replaced. But not this. Never this. Silas whistled a short, sharp note that cut through the evening air, and 3 horses emerged from the tree line. The lead animal was a magnificent chestnut mare with an intelligent eye and a disposition that suggested she tolerated humans rather than feared them. Silas guided Clara toward the mare. "This is Sentinel. She will carry you steady." He helped Clara up into the saddle, his hands firm and careful, making certain she was balanced before he stepped back. Clara noticed that he positioned himself between her and the darkening forest to the east as he took the reins and began to walk. Colton, the middle brother, mounted his own horse and fell into position behind them without being told. His back was to Clara, his eyes on the trail they had come from. He rode with the easy alertness of a man who expected trouble, not because he was paranoid, but because experience had taught him it usually arrived. Boone rode alongside Clara on the third horse, the trunk and satchel secured behind his saddle. He talked as they moved through the forest, his voice light and easy, filling the silence with the kind of comfortable chatter that Clara suspected was designed specifically to keep her from thinking too hard about the fact that she was alone in the wilderness with three armed strangers as night fell. That creek is running higher than I have seen it in 3 years, Boone said. Spring melt came fast this year. Last week we had a black bear try to cross it about a quarter mile upstream. Current rolled him like a barrel. Even a bear knows when the water is winning. He told her about the landscape they were passing through, the names of the peaks visible against the darkening sky, the herd of elk that wintered in the valley to the north, the way the aspens turned gold in September so bright you would swear the mountains had caught fire. His voice was warm and melodic, and despite herself, Clara felt some of the rigid tension in her shoulders begin to ease. But she noticed that even as Boone talked and smiled, his amber eyes moved constantly scanning the trees, the ridgeline, the shadows between boulders. These were not careless men. These were men who had learned vigilance the hard way and who practiced it with the same unconscious discipline as breathing. The Vance cabin appeared in a small clearing after 20 minutes of riding through pine forest so dense the last light barely penetrated. Clara's first impression was of solidity. The structure was built from heavy logs chinked tight against wind and weather, with a stone chimney rising from one end and a covered porch running the length of the front wall. Smoke drifted from the chimney in a thin gray plume, suggesting the fire had been banked rather than abandoned, which meant they had not been far from home when they heard the crash of her wagon. Two smaller cabins flanked the main structure at angles, forming a rough triangle around a packed earth clearing that served as a shared yard. Clara, even in her exhausted state, recognized the arrangement for what it was. Not accidental, not convenient, tactical. Three structures with clear sight lines to each other and to the approaches from the forest. These men had built their home the way soldiers built a defensive position. "It is not much," Silas said as he helped her dismount. His hands lingered at her waist for a moment longer than strictly necessary, steadying her when her knees threatened to give way. "But it is dry and warm." Inside, the main cabin was larger than it appeared from the outside. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, the banked coals still radiating heat. A table and four chairs of rough-hewn timber occupied the center of the room, and a bed stood against the far wall covered with a quilt that had seen years of use but was clean and carefully maintained. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, filling the space with a scent that Clara would come to associate with safety. Sage, rosemary, wild thyme, the smell of the mountains themselves captured and preserved. But what caught Clara's attention and held it was the bookshelf, small, built into the wall beside the fireplace and filled with volumes whose cracked leather spines spoke of years of handling. She tilted her head to read the titles in the firelight. Shakespeare, Marcus Aurelius, a collection of maps and geological surveys. Emerson's essays, the binding held together with careful stitching where it had split. These were not the possessions of an uneducated frontiersman. These were the books of a thinking man, a man who had retreated to the wilderness not because he lacked the capacity for civilization, but because he had seen enough of it to choose differently. "You will need dry clothes," Silas said, already moving to a wooden trunk against the wall. He pulled out a flannel shirt and a pair of denim trousers that would clearly engulf Clara's smaller frame. "They are clean. Boone is the smallest of us, though that is not saying much." Clara almost smiled at that. Boone Vance was easily 6'2" and built like a young oak tree. The idea that his clothes would fit her 5'3" frame was absurd. But they were dry, and dry was the only thing that mattered. "We will step outside while you change," Silas said. "All three of us. Take whatever time you need." The three brothers filed out without argument or hesitation. Colton went first, already scanning the clearing. Boone followed with a reassuring nod in Clara's direction. Silas went last, and as he reached the door, he paused without turning around. "You are safe here," he said quietly. "Whatever else you are carrying tonight, you can set it down for a few hours." Then he closed the door behind him, and Clara was alone. She peeled off her wet dress and undergarments with fingers that shook so badly she could barely manage the buttons. The cold had seeped into her bones, and the events of the day of the past 6 weeks pressed against the inside of her chest like a physical weight. She had been running for so long. First from Boston on the night she found her father bleeding out on the parlor floor, the life draining from his eyes even as he pressed the oilskin packet into her hands and whispered, "Go, Clara, take it and go. Do not stop until you reach your Uncle Russell in Laramie." Then from Philadelphia, where she thought she saw one of the men from that night watching her board a train. From Chicago, where a man in a brown coat had asked the hotel clerk about a young woman traveling alone from Boston. From Denver, where she had hired the wagon and driver who abandoned her at the first sign of rough terrain, taking most of her remaining money and leaving her to navigate the Wyoming wilderness alone. 6 weeks of looking over her shoulder. 6 weeks of sleeping with one eye open. 6 weeks of clutching her father's satchel and wondering if the knowledge inside it was worth the life it had already cost and the life it might still claim. Now here she stood in a stranger's cabin in the middle of nowhere, wearing a dead man's flannel shirt that hung to her knees and trousers she had to roll 6 times at the ankles, and for the first time in all those weeks, she was not looking over her shoulder. She did not know what to make of that. A knock at the door, Silas's voice low and respectful. "Decent, yes," Clara replied, running her fingers through her damp auburn hair in a futile attempt to make herself presentable. An old habit from another life. A life where presentation mattered, and young women from good families did not appear before strangers looking like drowned kittens in borrowed clothes. Silas entered first, his eyes finding hers briefly before moving to the fireplace where he added logs to the coals with practiced efficiency until flames leaped high and the cabin filled with warmth that made Clara's skin tingle as feeling returned to her extremities. Boone followed, carrying a cast-iron pot that he set over the fire with the ease of long practice. "Got deer stew from yesterday," Boone said. "Not fancy, but it will put heat in your belly and strengthen your bones." Colton entered last. He did not sit. He positioned himself near the door, one shoulder against the wall, arms crossed over his chest, watching Clara with an expression she could not read. It was not hostility exactly. It was something more complicated. Wariness, perhaps. The look of a man who had been surprised by something and did not appreciate surprises. The stew was better than anything Clara had eaten since leaving Boston. Rich with wild herbs and root vegetables and tender meat that fell apart on the tongue. She ate 2 bowls and would have been embarrassed about it if Boone had not been watching her with such obvious pleasure, refilling her bowl before she could ask. "A woman who eats with conviction," Boone said with that easy grin. "I like that. Most folks pick at my cooking like they are afraid of it." "Your cooking is afraid of itself sometimes," Colton muttered. From his post by the door, and Clara thought she saw the ghost of a smile cross his hard features before it disappeared. They ate in relative quiet after that. Silas asked Clara her name and her destination, nothing more. She told him Clara Whitmore and that she was headed to Laramie to meet her uncle. She did not elaborate. He did not press. "The bed is yours tonight," Silas said, when he noticed her eyelids growing heavy. "I will sleep outside. Colton and Boone have their own cabins." "I could not possibly take your bed," Clara protested, though the exhaustion pulling at her was almost beyond resistance. "You can," Silas said, and the way he said it left no room for argument. It was not rude, it was simply final. Nearly drowning takes something from a person. You need real rest. Tomorrow we will ride into Cottonwood and get you on the next stage to Laramie. Colton checked the door latch on his way out. Boone banked the fire and placed a cup of water on the table beside the bed. Silas was the last to leave, and as he passed through the door, he placed something on the chair nearest the bed. Clara saw that it was a revolver, cleaned and loaded, positioned where her hand could find it in the dark. "Just in case," Silas said. "Though nothing is getting past the 3 of us tonight." The door closed. Clara heard their footsteps separating Colton's heavy and deliberate, Boone's lighter and quicker, Silas's barely audible at all. She laid down on the narrow bed and pulled the quilt to her chin. It smelled of pine and leather and wood smoke, and underneath those scents, something else. Something warm and distinctly masculine that she could not name, but that made her feel against all logic and reason that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She slept without dreaming for the first time in 6 weeks. Morning came through the cabin's single window in a shaft of gold that fell across Clara's face and woke her gently. For a moment, she did not know where she was. Then memory returned in a rush, and she sat up quickly, finding herself alone. Her clothes, dry now, lay folded at the foot of the bed. Someone had brought them in during the night and placed them there without waking her. The care of that gesture, the thoughtfulness of it, made something tighten in Clara's throat. She dressed quickly, grateful to be back in her own garments, despite the fact that her proper Boston traveling dress was laughably impractical for the frontier. The navy blue fabric was stained and torn from the creak. The lace at the collar was shredded. The hem was caked with mud. She looked, she thought, like exactly what she was. A woman who had come a very long way and had further still to go. Outside, the morning was brilliant and sharp, the air so clean it felt like drinking cold water. Colton was chopping wood at a stump near the edge of the clearing. Each stroke of the axe was powerful and precise, splitting logs with a single blow that spoke of years of practice and a body built for heavy labor. He had removed his shirt in the morning warmth, and Clara saw the scars that mapped his back, old wounds healed white against sun-browned skin. Rope burns on his forearms, a bullet graze across one shoulder, the marks of a man who had seen war and carried it in his flesh. He sensed her presence and turned immediately, reaching for his shirt and pulling it on with a quick motion that suggested self-consciousness. "Morning," he said. "Sleep all right, better than I have in weeks," Clara admitted. "I am sorry to have displaced you all from your home." Colton waved the apology away with one large hand and drove his axe into the chopping block. His expression was already closing off, retreating behind the wall she would come to know well. "Silas wants to ride into Cottonwood today. Get you on a stage to Laramie." The ride to Cottonwood took an hour through terrain that stole Clara's breath in ways that had nothing to do with fear. The Wyoming Territory in spring was a landscape so vast and wild and beautiful that it made the crowded streets of Boston seem like something from a fever dream. Mountains rose in every direction, their peaks still crowned with snow, their slopes covered with pine and aspen and wild meadow grass. The sky was so blue and so enormous that Clara felt she could fall upward into it and never hit bottom. She rode behind Silas on Sentinel, her hands gripping the sides of his jacket for balance. She noticed that he rode with one hand on the reins and one hand free, resting near, but not on the revolver at his hip. Colton rode ahead, scouting the trail. Boone rode behind, watching their back trail. They moved through the wilderness like men who understood it intimately, reading the land the way Clara read books, with comprehension and respect. Cottonwood was little more than a scatter of wooden buildings straddling the stage route. A general store, a saloon, a small white church, a handful of homes. The sort of settlement that existed because the wilderness needed provisioning points and human stubbornness needed company. Silas guided Sentinel toward a two-story building with Brannigan's Mercantile and Post painted across its weathered facade. Inside, they found a barrel-chested man with impressive sideburns arranging goods on a shelf. He turned at their entrance, and his bushy eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "Silas Vance," he said, "twice in 1 month. The mountains must be getting crowded for you to grace us so often." Hector Silas replied with the smallest of nods. "This is Miss Clara Whitmore. She had trouble on the trail, lost her wagon in Cottonwood Creek. She needs passage to Laramie." Hector Brannigan's gaze shifted to Clara, his expression immediately sympathetic. "Terrible luck, Miss Whitmore. That creek is running mean this spring." He rubbed his chin and blew out a breath. "I'm afraid the stage will not come through for another 5 days. Had a breakdown east of here." Axle snapped clean through. 5 days. The words landed in Clara's stomach like stones. 5 days stranded in this tiny settlement. 5 days sitting still, while the men who murdered her father could be anywhere behind her, following the same trail, asking the same questions, getting closer with every hour she was not moving. "Is there anyone heading toward Laramie who might offer me transport?" Clara asked, fighting to keep the desperation from her voice. Hector shook his head slowly. "Not that I know of. Most folks stay close to home this time of year. Trails too muddy for comfortable travel." The mercantile door swung open and 3 men entered, local farmers, by the look of them, dusty and sun-worn and perfectly ordinary. Clara stepped back so quickly she nearly knocked over a display of tinned goods. Her body went rigid, her hand moving involuntarily toward the satchel she carried against her chest. She caught herself, forced her shoulders down, breathed, but the damage was done. When she looked up, she found all 3 Vance brothers watching her, Boone with open concern, Colton with a sharp, calculating attention, and Silas, those amber eyes missing nothing, a question forming behind them that Clara prayed he would not ask out loud. "Miss Whitmore will need some supplies," Silas said to Hector, still watching Clara. "Clothes suitable for the frontier. Whatever she needs." "I cannot afford." Clara began the words thick with the humiliation of admitting that most of her money was somewhere at the bottom of Cottonwood Creek or soaked beyond recognition in a ruined trunk. "Consider it a loan," Silas interrupted. His voice was quiet, but it carried the same immovable quality she had noticed the night before. You can repay me when you reach your uncle in Laramie. Colton moved to a rack of ready-made clothing and pulled down a wide-brimmed hat. He walked to where Clara stood and held it out to her without ceremony. Sun out here will burn that city skin of yours in an hour, he said. His tone was gruff, almost dismissive. But his eyes lingered on her face for a moment longer than the gesture required. Boone appeared at her elbow with a pair of sturdy leather boots and a small silk scarf the color of a spring sky. Every lady needs something pretty, he said, and his smile was so genuine and so warm that Clara felt tears prick the backs of her eyes for no reason she could name. Even out here. 3 gifts, 3 brothers, 3 different languages of care, each one offered without expectation and without explanation. Clara stood in that dusty mercantile holding a hat and boots and a scrap of blue silk, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Something that had been frozen solid for 6 weeks beginning just barely to thaw. Outside the store, Silas drew her aside. His voice dropped low enough that only she could hear, and his amber eyes held hers with an intensity that made her want to step back, even as it made her unable to look away. You are running from something, he said. It was not a question. Clara lifted her chin. The gesture was instinctive, a remnant of Boston propriety, and Whitmore pride that even 6 weeks of terror had not beaten out of her. Are we not all running from something? Mr. Vance. Silas did not smile, did not blink. He studied her the way she imagined he had once studied enemy territory, from the shadows reading the terrain for what it could tell him about the danger ahead. 5 days in a town this small makes you vulnerable, he said. Whatever you are afraid of, it will find you here. Our cabin is safer, remote. No one would look for you there. The offer hung between them in the morning air, heavy with implications that Clara understood perfectly. She barely knew this man. She had spent one night under his roof and eaten one meal at his table. In Boston, what he was suggesting would have been unthinkable. But Boston was 2,000 miles and a lifetime away, and the rules that governed survival in the Wyoming Territory were written in a different language entirely. Why would you do that? Clara asked, searching his face for hidden motives and finding none. Only that steady amber gaze, calm and certain as the mountains themselves. Because I know what it looks like, Silas said, when someone is being hunted. Behind them, Colton's voice rose in sharp protest. Clara turned to see the 2 older brothers standing apart from the group, their conversation low but heated. Colton gestured toward Clara with barely contained frustration. She caught fragments. We cannot trust a stranger. You are bringing trouble to our door. We do not need this, Silas. We do not need her. Silas said something in response, a single sentence spoken too quietly for Clara to hear. Whatever it was, it stopped Colton mid-word. The middle brother stared at his older sibling for a long moment, his jaw working, his amber eyes burning. Then he turned and walked away without another word. Boone stood beside Clara, through all of it uncharacteristically silent, his eyes moving between his 2 brothers, with an expression that told Clara this kind of disagreement was rare and significant. Clara made her decision. She did not make it because she had no other options, though that was true. She did not make it because Silas Vance inspired trust, though he did. She made it because the same instincts that had kept her alive since fleeing Boston, the instincts that told her when a shadow on a train platform was watching too carefully, when a question from a hotel clerk carried too much curiosity, those instincts looked at Silas Vance and said, this one will stand between you and the dark. Your cabin, she said firmly, if the offer still stands. Something moved behind Silas's eyes. Not quite relief. Not quite satisfaction. Something more vulnerable than either. It does, he said. On the ride back to Cottonwood Creek, Clara sat in front of Silas on Sentinel. He had changed their arrangement without explanation, but Clara understood. In this position, his body was between her and anyone approaching from behind. His arms reached around her to hold the reins, and she was enclosed in a space that felt, despite everything, like shelter. They had ridden for perhaps 20 minutes in silence when Silas spoke. I sent word to a friend in Cheyenne, he said, through the telegraph office. Asked him to let me know if anyone has been asking about a woman matching your description heading west. Clara stiffened in the saddle. You had no right. I had every right, Silas replied. His voice was firm but not unkind. You are staying under my roof. I need to know what kind of trouble might come calling. I am not a criminal, Clara said, because it was the most important thing. and because it was true. Never thought you were, Silas said. But that does not mean you are not in danger. They rode in silence for several more miles. The rhythm of Sentinel's hooves beat a steady counterpoint to the pounding of Clara's heart. She could feel the warmth of Silas's chest behind her, the controlled strength of his arms on either side. She could smell pine and leather and gun oil and something underneath all of it that was simply him. Finally, because the weight of her secret had become heavier than the weight of her fear, Clara spoke. My father was murdered 6 weeks ago. The words fell into the mountain air like stones into still water. The men who killed him believe he gave me something before he died, something valuable. Silas did not respond immediately. His body had gone very still, behind her the way she imagined a wolf went still when it caught a scent on the wind. They are right, Clara continued, her voice steady despite the trembling she could not quite control. He did give it to me. A journal and a map. My father was a geologist, Professor Alistair Whitmore of Boston. He discovered a silver deposit in the mountains near Laramie, a significant one. His former colleague, a man named Malcolm Graves, brought men to our home demanding the map. When father refused, they shot him. I was upstairs. They did not know I was there. She took a breath that shuddered through her whole body. I have been running ever since. Behind her, Silas was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with something Clara recognized as controlled fury. The voice of a man who had learned long ago that anger was most dangerous when it was quiet. You will be safe at our cabin, Clara. I promise you that. Not while I am breathing. It was the way he said her name that undid her. Not Miss Whitmore. Not me, am, Clara. Spoken with a softness that existed beneath the steel, a tenderness that seemed almost to surprise him, as though he had not known that particular sound still lived somewhere inside him. And riding through the Wyoming wilderness on the back of a chestnut mare, enclosed in the arms of a man she had known for less than a day, Clara Whitmore allowed herself to believe him. But what Clara did not know, what she could not yet see from the shelter of Silas Vance's arms, was that the danger following her was closer than she imagined. And before this was over, believing him would not be enough. She would have to trust him with something far more valuable than her father's map. She would have to trust him with her life. They reached the cabin as the afternoon shadows stretched long across the clearing. Silas began securing the perimeter, immediately moving with the efficient purpose of a man who had done this many times before. He checked sight lines from every window. He tested the strength of the door latch. He positioned furniture to block direct observation from outside. I was a scout during the war, he explained as he worked. Union Army. Learned to make a position defensible with limited resources. Colton appeared from the tree line carrying coils of thin wire and a pouch of small brass bells. Without speaking to Clara or acknowledging her presence, he began stringing the wire at ankle height across the approaches to the clearing, attaching the bells at intervals. Trip lines. Anyone approaching through the forest in the dark would announce themselves before they reached the cabins. Boone emerged from his own cabin carrying a canvas pack that he set at Clara's feet. Emergency supplies, he said, his usual smile replaced by an expression of sober practicality. Dried food water matches a compass. If things go bad and we tell you to run, you grab this and go. There is a game trail behind the main cabin that leads to a ravine. Follow the ravine south. It will take you to the stage road. Clara looked at the three brothers, each engaged in the serious business of protecting her life, and she felt the full weight of what she had brought to their door. These men lived in peace. They had built their solitary world deliberately as a refuge from whatever the war had done to them. And now she had arrived with death on her heels and shattered that peace without asking permission. I should leave, she said. I am putting all of you in danger. 3 pairs of amber eyes turned to her simultaneously. And for the first time since she had stumbled into their lives, dripping wet and half drowned, and clutching her dead father's secrets to her chest, all 3 Vance brothers were in complete agreement. No one touches you, Clara Silas said, and his voice carried the finality of a door closing against the wind. Not while we are breathing, any of us. Colton nodded once, sharp and definitive. Boone placed his hand briefly on her shoulder, warm and steady. That is what good men do, he said simply. That night, after a supper of venison stew and cornbread that Boone prepared with surprising skill over the cabin fire, Clara lay on Silas's bed and listened to the sounds of her new reality. The crack and pop of the fire, the wind moving through the pines, The soft, measured footsteps of whoever was keeping watch outside, circling the clearing, with the patience of a man who understood that protection was not a single act, but a sustained discipline. She heard Colton's boots on the porch, heavy and deliberate, pausing at her door as he made his rounds. She heard Boone settle into his own cabin next door, the faint sound of a guitar being tuned carrying through the walls. She knew that somewhere in the darkness, Silas sat at the high point overlooking the valley, watching the approaches with eyes that had once earned him the name Ghost for his ability to move through enemy territory unseen. Three men, three strangers who had pulled her from a creek and fed her and given her shelter, and were now standing guard over her life as though she were something precious. Clara pressed her face into the pillow that smelled of pine and leather and breathed deeply and tried not to think about what she was beginning to feel. Because the most frightening thing in her life at that moment was not the men who might be tracking her through the Wyoming wilderness. The most frightening thing was the realization that when the time came to leave this place and continue to Laramie, she was no longer certain she would want to go. Outside in the darkness beyond the cabin walls, a bell on one of Colton's tripwires rang once sharp and clear in the mountain silence. Then all three brothers were on their feet, weapons in hand, moving through the night with the silent coordination of men who had done this before in places far more dangerous than a mountain clearing in Wyoming. Clara gripped the revolver Silas had left beside her bed and held her breath. Something was out there, in the darkness, getting closer. And the longest night of Clara Whitmore's life was only beginning. The bell had been a deer. Colton confirmed it at first light, crouching over the tracks where a young doe had wandered through the tripwire and bolted at the sound. He showed Clara the hoof prints in the soft earth, the broken wire where the animal had torn free, the scattered brass bell lying in the pine needles 10 yards from where it had been strung. His voice was matter-of-fact, but his eyes told a different story. He had not slept after the alarm. None of them had. Silas stood on the porch with his rifle across his forearms, watching the tree line with the patient stillness of a man who could outweigh stone. "A deer tonight," he said quietly. "Might not be a deer next time." He turned to Boone. "I need you to ride into Cottonwood today. Send a telegram to Jack Parrish in Cheyenne. Ask him if anyone has been making inquiries about a young woman traveling west from Boston. Blonde hair, early 20s, traveling alone." Clara, standing in the cabin doorway with her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that Boone had brewed before dawn, felt a flash of anger at the violation of her privacy. She opened her mouth to protest. Silas cut her off without looking at her. "You are under our roof, Clara. We cannot fight what we cannot see coming." Colton, who had opposed nearly every decision Silas had made since Clara's arrival, surprised her by speaking up in support of his brother. "He is right. We need to know what is moving toward us. I did not string those wires for exercise." It was the first time the two older brothers had agreed on anything related to Clara's presence, and the significance of it settled over the clearing like a change in weather. Colton had made his choice. Whatever reservations remained behind those guarded amber eyes, he had decided that Clara Whitmore was someone worth protecting. Boone saddled his horse and rode out within the hour, his usual smile replaced by an expression of focused intent that reminded Clara how easily she had been deceived by his cheerful surface. Beneath the jokes and the warmth and the easy laughter, Boone Vance was every inch his brother's equal in capability and in danger. His absence left Clara alone with Silas and Colton for the first time, and the dynamic between the three of them shifted in ways she felt but could not yet name. The storm arrived that afternoon. Not the gentle spring rain Clara had known in Boston, where showers tapped politely against window glass and puddles formed in cobblestone streets. This was a Wyoming storm, a wall of black cloud that rolled across the mountains like something alive and angry, bringing wind that bent the pines horizontal and rain that fell in sheets so thick the clearing disappeared behind a curtain of water. Thunder cracked directly overhead with a sound like the earth splitting open, and lightning turned the world white and sharp-edged for frozen instants before plunging it back into premature darkness. The three of them were confined to the main cabin, and the space that had seemed adequate for one man suddenly felt very small with three people in it. Silas sat by the window watching the storm with the alert patience he brought to everything. Colton occupied a chair near the door, cleaning his rifle with methodical precision, each movement exact and unhurried. Clara sat at the table, her father's journal open before her, though the words blurred and swam each time thunder shook the cabin walls. It was Silas who broke the silence. He did not look at Clara when he spoke. He looked at the rain streaming down the window glass, and his voice came from somewhere far away, somewhere deeper than the cabin, or the mountain, or the storm. I enlisted in 61, he said. 19th Virginia Infantry Union Side. My father was a school teacher in the Shenandoah Valley. Never owned a slave. Believed in the Constitution the way some men believe in God, with everything he had and nothing held back. Our neighbors did not share his convictions. He paused. The fire crackled. Rain hammered the roof. When the three of us signed on with the Union, they burned our farm to the ground. Mother was still inside. Father got her out, but the smoke had done its damage. She lasted 2 months. He followed her before Christmas. Clara set down her coffee cup. The words, "I am sorry," formed on her lips, but stopped there, inadequate and small, against the scope of what he was telling her. I became a scout, Silas continued. They called me the Ghost because I could move through Confederate territory without being detected. I was good at it. Too good. You do not earn a name like that without doing things that change you in places you cannot reach to fix. He turned from the window then, and Clara saw his eyes clearly for the first time since the story began. The amber had gone dark the way a river goes dark when the bottom drops away. War does not make heroes, Clara. It makes survivors. There is a difference most people never learn, and those who do learn it wish they had not. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full-weighted with the trust implicit in what Silas had shared. He had opened a door that Clara suspected had been sealed for a very long time, and the effort of it showed in the tension along his jaw and the careful stillness of his hands. Then Colton spoke. He did not look up from his rifle. His voice was low and rough, as though the words had to travel through something sharp to reach the air. There was a girl, he said, back in Virginia, Sarah Calloway. Her family had the farm next to ours. We were promised to each other before the war. She was 16. I was 17. I told her I would come back and we would be married in the spring. His hands stopped moving on the rifle. The cleaning cloth hung motionless between his fingers. When I came back, the farm was ashes. Sarah was buried in the churchyard. Typhus took her the winter of 63. She was 18 years old and she died alone because I was 300 miles away, fighting a war I did not start for people who did not care if I lived or died. He looked up then, and Clara saw something in Colton Vance's face that she had not seen before. Not anger, not bitterness, grief, raw and old and carried so long it had worn grooves in him the way water wears grooves in stone. I built a wall after that, Colton said, and his amber eyes found Clara's and held them with an intensity that stopped her breath. Told myself I would never let anyone get close enough to hurt me like that again. He paused. The fire popped. Rain drove against the windows. You are making that wall very hard to keep standing, Clara Whitmore. The words landed between them like a lit match on dry timber. And something in the honesty of it, in the rawness of this man, in admitting what it cost him to feel again, broke the last of Clara's defenses. Not the ones she had built against Colton, or Silas, or the wilderness. The ones she had built against herself. She did not make a sound. The tears simply came sliding down her cheeks in the firelight, silent and unstoppable. 6 weeks of terror and grief and exhaustion finally finding their way out through the only door she had left unguarded. She pressed her hands against her face as though she could hold herself together by force, and her shoulders shook with the effort of crying quietly in front of a man she barely knew. Colton went very still. His hands stopped on the rifle. He stared at Clara for a long moment, and then something shifted in his face, something old and hard cracking apart to reveal the raw earth beneath. He did not speak. He did not move to touch her. But his jaw clenched so tight the muscles stood out like rope, and his eyes burned with a fury that was not directed at Clara, but at whatever and whoever had put those tears on her face. Silas crossed the cabin in 2 strides and knelt before her. His large hands closed gently over hers and drew them away from her face. His amber eyes, steady and warm and endlessly patient, held hers without flinching from the grief they found there. You have been strong long enough, Clara, he said quietly. Let us carry some of that weight. It was the kindest thing anyone had said to her since her father died. Clara did not collapse into his arms. She was not that kind of woman. But she let the tears fall without hiding them. And she let Silas hold her hands, and she let Colton's silent, furious vigil from across the room be what it was, a man standing guard over someone else's pain because he could not fix it and could not leave it and could not look away. When the tears finally stopped, Clara drew a shuddering breath and straightened in her chair. She did not apologize. Silas did not expect her to. Then Silas stood and crossed to the door. "I should check the roof," he said. "Storm this hard finds leaks sometimes." He was gone before Clara could read his expression, but she did not need to see his face. She had seen the way his jaw tightened at Colton's earlier words, the sudden rigidity in his shoulders. She understood what was happening with a clarity that frightened her, because it meant this situation was more complicated than survival, more dangerous than the men who might be tracking her. Both brothers, both of them, feeling something they had not felt in years perhaps, had never expected to feel again. And she was the cause. Colton seemed to realize he had said too much. He returned to his rifle with renewed focus, his jaw set, his eyes deliberately averted. The vulnerability that had surfaced moments ago retreated behind familiar walls, and the man who remained was once again hard and closed and unreachable. Clara did not press him. She understood walls. She had built enough of her own. Boone returned from Cottonwood the following morning, and the expression on his face when he dismounted told Clara everything she needed to know before he spoke a single word. The easy smile was gone. The warmth in his eyes had been replaced by something cold and sharp that transformed his features and reminded her with a jolt that this gentle young man who sang folk songs and cooked venison stew with wild herbs had once been a 15-year-old boy carrying a rifle through the bloodiest war in American history. "3 men," Boone said without preamble. "Been asking about a young blonde woman traveling alone from the east. Described her to a clerk in Rawlins and a stable hand in Medicine Bow. Moving west along the stage route, 2, maybe 3 days behind us." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "And this, Hector Brannigan told me a well-dressed fellow came through Cottonwood 4 days ago. Educated. Asked about a missing student. Left this at the Mercantile." Clara took the paper. Her hands were steady, though her heart had begun to beat with the slow, heavy rhythm of dread. She unfolded it and read the words written in a hand she recognized instantly. Precise, elegant. The penmanship of a man who had spent 30 years writing academic papers and correspondence to university colleagues. "Miss Whitmore, your father's work belongs to the academic community. Return what you have stolen, and no further action will be necessary. A G. Malcolm Graves. Here, in Wyoming, not sending hired men from a safe distance back east. Here himself, close enough to leave notes in country stores close enough to smell." Clara realized she had stopped breathing. She forced air into her lungs and looked up at the 3 brothers who stood in a loose semicircle around her, reading her reaction the way experienced men read approaching weather. "Graves," she said, and her voice sounded distant to her own ears, as though it belonged to someone standing on the other side of a thick wall. "He is the one who had my father killed. His name is Malcolm Graves. He was my father's colleague at the university. His friend, or so father believed." She told them the rest then, the part she had held back. That Graves was not merely a thief with hired muscle. He was a man with standing, with credentials, with connections to institutions that would take his word over that of a 22-year-old woman fleeing across the frontier. He had already laid the groundwork for a legal claim asserting that Alistair Whitmore's discovery was joint university research, not personal work. Even if Clara reached Laramie, even if she registered the mining claim, Graves could challenge it through the courts, while simultaneously hunting her through the wilderness. The danger was not just bullets, it was law, it was reputation. It was a system that had always favored men like Malcolm Graves and would continue to favor them unless someone stood in the way. The 3 brothers held counsel around the table that night, and Clara watched the dynamics of their relationship play out in miniature. Colton wanted to take the fight to the enemy. "Find them on the trail," he said, leaning forward with the coiled energy of a man whose instinct in the face of threat was always to advance. "Hit them before they know where we are. End it before it starts." Boone favored evasion. "There is a pass through the mountains north of here," he said, tracing a route on the worn map Silas spread across the table. "Rough going, but it comes out near the Platte. We could have Clara in Laramie in 4 days without touching the stage road." Silas listened to both brothers without interruption. Then he placed his hands flat on the table and looked at the map for a long time. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet finality that Clara had come to recognize as his natural mode of command. "We stay, we prepare, and we wait." Colton started to object, but Silas raised his eyes from the map and met his brother's gaze with something that silenced the protest before it formed. I spent my entire war sneaking behind enemy lines, Silas said, running and hiding and striking from the shadows. I am done with that. This time I stand my ground. This time they come to us on ground we know in a position we have prepared. That is how this ends. The preparations took 2 days. Colton expanded his network of tripwires and added deadfall traps along the eastern approach, the most likely avenue for anyone following the stage road from Cottonwood. He established a sniper position on a rocky outcrop north of the clearing that offered a commanding view of the entire valley, and he spent an hour there each morning and evening, memorizing distances, calculating angles, reading the wind. Boone reinforced the root cellar beneath Silas's cabin and cleared the escape tunnel that Silas had dug years ago when he first built the structure. It was a narrow passage barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, emerging in a ravine behind the cabin that was invisible from the clearing. He stocked the tunnel with water food and a loaded pistol. Silas did what he had always done best. He thought, he planned, he anticipated. He walked the perimeter of the clearing at different times of day and night, studying how the light fell, where the shadows gathered which approaches offered cover and which left an attacker exposed. Clara watched all of this with a mixture of gratitude and guilt that sat in her stomach like an undigested meal. These men were preparing for war on her behalf, risking their lives, their home, their hard-won peace for a woman they had known less than a week. She tried to contribute where she could. Boone had taught her to shoot during those first days' patient afternoons behind the cabin with a Remington revolver that felt enormous in her small hands. She was not skilled, but she could hit a target at close range, and Colton had grudgingly acknowledged that her stance was improving. She also volunteered for watch duty, and after initial resistance, Silas agreed to let her take a 4-hour shift each night, freeing one of the brothers for rest. My father taught me to handle a firearm, she told Silas when he questioned her capability. He believed women should be able to defend themselves. Smart man, Silas said, and something in his voice told Clara he meant it as more than a casual compliment. He was honoring her father, a man he had never met, through the daughter who carried his courage as well as his secrets. It was during one of these night watches on the 4th evening of her stay that Clara finally opened the letter she had been carrying in her father's journal since Boston. She had seen it there the first night, tucked between the pages of geological calculations, her name written on the envelope in her father's familiar hand. She had not opened it because she knew with the certainty of a daughter who understood her father that whatever was inside would break something in her that she could not afford to have broken. Not yet. Not while she was still running, but she was not running anymore. She was sitting in a cabin in the Wyoming mountains with a revolver in her lap and 3 men sleeping in shifts to keep her alive. And the letter was burning a hole through the leather of the journal, in the oilskin wrapping and the fabric of her dress and the skin of her chest where she carried it closest to her heart. She opened it by firelight with the cabin quiet around her and the night pressing against the windows. My dearest Clara, her father had written. If you are reading this, then the worst has happened and I was not strong enough or clever enough to prevent it. I am sorry, not for the discovery which belongs to you now and will provide for your future, but for the choices I made that put you in danger. I should never have arranged your engagement to Harold Pemberton. I told myself it was for your security, but the truth is I was afraid. Afraid of losing you the way I lost your mother. Afraid that if I did not anchor you to a safe life, you would drift into the same wild currents that took her from me. But safety without love is just a gilded cage, and you, my Clara, were never meant for cages. Promise me you will choose love. Choose the man or the life that makes your soul sing, not the one that merely keeps you comfortable. Your mother chose love when she left Ireland for a strange country and a man she barely knew. It was the bravest thing she ever did, and it gave me you. Be brave, my girl. Be brave and be happy. All my love, Father. Clara folded the letter carefully and pressed it against her chest. Tears ran down her cheeks in the firelight, silent and hot, and she let them come without fighting. Through the window, she could see the dark shapes of the 3 brothers moving through their watches. Silas at the high point, Colton circling the perimeter, Boone on the porch, his silhouette large and steady against the stars. 3 men, 3 versions of loyalty and strength and tenderness. Her father had told her to choose love, to choose the life that made her soul sing. She was beginning to hear the music. The near miss happened on the sixth day, and it shattered whatever illusion of safety the quiet days had built. Clara and Silas had walked to the creek to fill water containers, a task that required two people. Since the safest access point was a quarter-mile from the cabin, the afternoon sun filtered through the canopy in shafts of gold, and the creek, the same creek that had nearly killed Clara by 6 days earlier, ran clear and cold and beautiful over its bed of smooth stones. Silas stopped walking. Clara, 2 paces behind him, nearly collided with his back. She looked up to ask what was wrong and found him staring at the water with an expression she had not seen before. Not alert, not guarded, open. The stone mask he wore as naturally as his hat had cracked, and through the fissure she glimpsed something that made her chest ache. "You have changed everything," he said. His voice was low and rough, as though the words had to be dragged out of him by force. "This cabin, this mountain, me." Clara's heart began to beat in a rhythm she did not recognize. Silas turned to face her, and the afternoon light caught his eyes and turned them to liquid amber, warm and deep, and full of something that had been locked away for more than 10 years. The distance between them closed. Not quickly, not with the reckless urgency of youth. Slowly, deliberately, the way a river carves its path through stone, irresistible and patient and certain of its destination. His head lowered toward hers. She could see the scar above his eyebrow, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the ghost of stubble along his jaw. She closed her eyes. The gunshot cracked across the valley like a whip against glass. Silas had Clara behind him and his revolver drawn before the echo faded. His body became a wall between her and the direction of the sound, his breathing steady, his eyes sweeping the tree line with the razor focus of a man for whom this response was as automatic as blinking. Colton's voice carried from the direction of the cabin, sharp and clear. "Rider on the eastern ridge. Fired a warning." They bolted. They ran back to the clearing, Clara's water containers abandoned on the creek bank. Colton stood at the edge of the yard, rifle in hand, his eyes tracking something in the distance that Clara could not see. His breathing was controlled, but his jaw was tight, the muscles standing out like cables beneath sun-browned skin. Boone returned from the forest 20 minutes later, having tracked the intruder's trail until it intersected with the main path toward Cottonwood. He carried something in his hand, a piece of paper folded once dropped on the trail in what might have been haste or might have been calculation. Clara took it, read it, felt the blood leave her face, the same precise handwriting. But the message had changed. The civility was gone. "Miss Whitmore, I know where you are. I know who is sheltering you. This ends now one way or another. You have until morning." "Ah, gee, he found us," Clara whispered. "He found you," Silas corrected, and his voice had gone cold in a way she had not heard before. The warmth of the creek bank was gone, replaced by something ancient and lethal. The ghost, she thought. This is who he was before he came to the mountains. This is who he becomes when someone threatens what he has claimed as his to protect. "But he has not got you yet," Silas said, "and he will not. Not while any of us draws breath." That night, the last night before the violence that was coming as surely as winter follows autumn, Clara could not sleep. She sat in the chair by the window with the revolver across her knees and watched the darkness and waited for Colton and Boone to complete their patrol and for Silas to return from the high point where he kept his solitary vigil. He came in near midnight. His face was shadowed. The fire burned too low to illuminate the cabin, but she could see the outline of him in the doorway, broad and tall, filling the frame the way he filled every space he occupied. Not with noise or bluster, with presence. The simple, undeniable fact of who he was. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, stepping inside and closing the door against the night, "there is something I need you to know." Clara waited, her hands tightened around the revolver in her lap. Silas moved to the fireplace and crouched to add wood to the coals. The flames caught slowly, then rose, painting his face in warm light and deep shadow. He did not look at her when he spoke. "From the moment I pulled you from that creek, something woke up inside me. Something I thought the war killed dead more than 10 years ago. I have been empty since Appomattox, Clara. Going through the motions of living without actually being alive. And then you fell into that water, and I reached in after you, and whatever it was that died in me started breathing again." He looked at her then. His amber eyes were bright with firelight, and with something else, something that cost him visibly to show. I will not ask you for anything, not your heart, not your future, but I need you to know that mine belongs to you. It has belonged to you since that first moment, and it will belong to you whether you stay or go or never think of me again after you reach Laramie. Clara rose from the chair. She crossed the space between them and placed her hand against his chest over his heart. She could feel it beating beneath her palm, strong and steady, the heart of a man who had survived everything the world could throw at him and had come out the other side, still capable of tenderness. Silas, she whispered. The cabin door opened. Colton stood in the threshold, the cold night air rushing in around him. His eyes moved from Clara's face to her hand on Silas's chest, and something happened behind those amber eyes that Clara would remember for the rest of her life. Pain, sharp and immediate and instantly suppressed, shoved down behind the wall. He had spent 15 years building the wall he had told her just days ago she was making impossible to maintain. Perimeter is clear, Colton said. His voice was flat, controlled, empty of everything except the words themselves. I will take the next watch. He turned and left. The door closed behind him. Not slammed. Something worse than slammed. Closed with the careful precision of a man exercising absolute control over himself because the alternative was unthinkable. Through the cabin wall, Clara heard his footsteps on the porch. Heavy, measured, back and forth, back and forth. The pacing of a man fighting a war inside himself that had no winning side. Silas closed his eyes. His chest rose and fell beneath Clara's hand in a long, slow breath that seemed to carry the weight of everything he understood about his brother and about the impossible geometry of what was happening between the three of them. Go to sleep, Clara, he said quietly. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. She lay in the bed but did not sleep. She listened to Colton's footsteps pacing the porch until they finally stopped, replaced by the creak of a chair and then silence. She thought about Silas, whose heart had beaten so strong beneath her hand, about Colton, whose wall was crumbling and whose pain was the pain of a man who had sworn never to love again and was breaking that oath against his will, about Boone, whose laughter hid a loneliness so deep she had glimpsed it only once in the gray light of dawn by a creek that had no right to be so beautiful in a place so hard. Her father had told her to choose love. She had chosen. She had known perhaps from the very beginning. From the moment Silas Vance pulled her from the water and told death it did not have permission to take her today. But choosing one heart meant breaking others, and that was the cost of love that her father's letter had not mentioned. Outside, the first gray light of dawn touched the mountain peaks, and from somewhere in the forest to the east, coming closer with the slow inevitability of weather, three riders began their approach toward the cabin in the clearing by Cottonwood Creek. Boone's voice came through the cabin door low and urgent and stripped of every trace of the gentle young man who cooked venison stew and sang folk songs by the fire. Three riders from the east, moving slow. They will be here by sunrise. And from the clearing below, Silas Vance's voice rose like iron drawn from a forge. Quiet, certain, final. Clara, get to the cellar, now. Clara did not go to the cellar. She went to the satchel first. Her fingers found the oilskin packet in the dark, and she pressed it inside her bodice flat against her ribs, where it would stay hidden and stay close. Her father's journal, her father's map, the last things his hands had touched before the light left his eyes. She would not leave them behind for anyone. Then she picked up the revolver. The cabin smelled of cold ash and pine resin and the faint metallic edge of fear, though whose fear she could not have said. Perhaps her own. Perhaps it was simply what the air tasted like before violence arrived. Through the shattered remains of sleep and silence, Clara heard the brothers moving. Not speaking. They did not need to speak. Whatever language existed between the three Vance men had been forged in places where words were too slow and too loud, and what remained was something closer to instinct. She heard Colton's boots on the packed earth of the clearing, quick and purposeful, heading north toward the rocky outcrop where he had spent days memorizing distances and wind patterns. She heard Boone checking the bolt on the rear door, the soft click of a hammer being drawn back, the steady rhythm of his breathing. And she heard Silas, not his footsteps because Silas Vance moved through the world with a silence that had once earned him a name whispered in fear through Confederate camps from Virginia to Tennessee. She heard his voice low and close coming from the other side of the cabin door. Colton takes the high ground. He has the best eyes and the steadiest hand at distance. Boone, you stay in the cabin with Clara. If the door is breached, you take her through the tunnel. You do not stop. You do not look back. And you, Boone said. His voice was stripped of everything but the bare question. I go out front, Silas replied. I draw them in. Let them see one man. Let them think that is all there is. A pause, the wind moved through the pines. Somewhere in the forest, a bird sang 3 notes and fell silent as though it too could feel what was coming. Silas Boone said, and the single word carried everything the younger brother could not say in the minutes they had left. I know, Silas answered, and then quieter. Take care of her, Boone, whatever happens. You and Colton both. That is the mission. She survives. Everything else is secondary. The door opened and Boone came inside. In the gray half-light before dawn, his face looked 10 years older than it had the night they pulled Clara from the creek. The easy smile was gone. The gentle warmth was gone. What remained was the boy who had picked up a rifle at 15 and carried it through 2 years of killing and come out the other side with a smile stitched over the wound to keep the bleeding hidden. He positioned himself near the front window rifle angled to cover the door and the eastern approach. His body blocked Clara's path to the entrance. Not by accident. Clara moved to the side window, the one that offered a partial view of the clearing and the tree line beyond. She could see Silas standing on the porch, his rifle held loosely across his body, his shoulders square, his silhouette carved against the lightning sky like something chiseled from the mountain itself. He looked, she thought, like a man who had made peace with whatever the next few minutes would bring. Not resigned, not afraid, simply ready. The voice came from the trees just as the first edge of sunlight crested the eastern ridge. Hello, the house. We are looking for a young lady, Miss Clara Whitmore. Her family is worried sick about her. The voice was polished, educated. It carried the careful enunciation of a man accustomed to lecture halls and faculty meetings and dinner conversations with university donors. But underneath the civility was something else, something that Clara recognized the way a rabbit recognizes the shadow of a hawk. Calculation. The cold arithmetic of a man who weighed human lives on the same scale as academic citations and always found them wanting. Malcolm Graves, here in the flesh, close enough to kill. Silas did not move from the porch. His voice carried across the clearing with the flat authority of a man stating facts that were not subject to negotiation. No ladies here, just me and my brothers. You are on private land. I would advise you to turn around. Silence. Clara strained her ears and caught the faint sound of whispered conversation from the tree line. 2 voices, perhaps 3, conferring in low tones that did not carry. Then the world exploded. The first shot punched through the cabin window in a shower of glass that sprayed across the floor like thrown diamonds. Boone shoved Clara down his body, covering hers before the shards had finished falling, and from outside she heard Silas returning fire from behind the porch column. 3 measured shots, spaced with the mechanical precision of a man who had been trained to make every round count. From the high ground to the north, Colton's rifle spoke once. A single crack that echoed off the mountainsides and was followed immediately by a cry of pain from the tree line. First blood. Colton had found his mark. A second attacker broke from the trees at a dead sprint, firing as he ran toward the cabin. The bullets thudded into the log walls, punching through the chinking, but not the timber. Silas stepped out from behind the column and fired twice. The first shot missed. The second caught the running man in the leg and sent him tumbling into the dirt of the clearing, his weapon skittering away across the packed earth. Then there was Malcolm Graves. He did not come through the front door. He did not charge across the clearing with a gun blazing. Malcolm Graves had not survived 30 years in academia by being direct. He circled, patient and deliberate, moving through the forest with a care that spoke of planning and observation. He found the side window of the cabin, the one Clara had been looking through moments before, the one that Boone focused on the front assault had his back to. Clara heard the scrape of a boot on the window frame. She turned and saw a hand, then an arm, then the face of a man she had last seen standing in her father's parlor in Boston, while 2 strangers held her father at gunpoint and demanded the work of his lifetime. Malcolm Graves was smaller than she remembered, thin and precise with silver hair, swept back from a high forehead and eyes the color of slate. He wore a traveling coat that was too fine for the frontier and boots that had never been muddied before this week. In his hand was a derringer, small and elegant, the kind of weapon a gentleman carried for situations that could not be resolved through conversation. Miss Whitmore, he said, and his voice was as calm as if they were meeting at a faculty reception. We meet again. Where are your father's papers? Boone spun from the front window, his rifle coming up, but Graves was faster in the way that mattered. He seized Clara's arm and pulled her in front of him before Boone could draw a bead, pressing the derringer's muzzle against her ribs with a pressure that was precise and unhurried and absolutely certain. Drop your weapon, boy, Graves said, or she dies right here. Boone's face went white. His hands, which Clara had watched knead bread dough and tune a guitar and gentle a nervous horse, were steady on the rifle. But his eyes told the truth. He was terrified. Not for himself, for her. He lowered the rifle. You hurt her, Boone said, and his voice had changed into something Clara had never heard from him. Low and cold and carrying the promise of consequences that existed beyond the reach of law or mercy. You hurt her, and you do not leave this mountain alive. That is not a threat, Professor. That is geography. Graves smiled. It was a thin expression that did not reach his slate-colored eyes. Touching, he said, Now, the papers. Clara's mind was very clear, clearer than it had been at any point since the night her father died. She could feel the derringer against her ribs. She could feel Graves's grip on her arm tight, but not crushing the grip of a man who had calculated the exact amount of force needed and applied no more. She could hear gunfire still crackling outside Silas and Colton engaged with the remaining attackers. She could feel the oilskin packet pressed against her chest, her father's life work warm from her own body heat. She thought of her father, of his gentle hands and his careful mind, and the way he had looked at her on the last night of his life, pressing the satchel into her arms with fingers already growing cold. She thought of his letter. Be brave, my girl. Clara let her body go limp. She dropped straight down, every ounce of her becoming dead weight in Graves's one-handed grip. The professor staggered, his hold on her arm breaking as physics overruled intention. The derringer discharged into the ceiling, a sharp crack and a puff of plaster dust, and then Boone was moving. He crossed the cabin in 2 strides and hit Graves with his shoulder like a battering ram, driving the smaller man into the wall with force enough to crack the timber. The derringer clattered to the floor. Graves crumpled, gasping, his fine coat torn, and his silver hair disarranged for the first time in what Clara suspected was decades. The front door burst open. Silas came through it, with blood on his sleeve and his revolver leveled and his eyes burning with an intensity that Clara felt in her spine. Behind him, through the ruined doorway, she could see the clearing in the early morning light. One man down near the tree line clutching his shoulder, another on the ground in the middle of the yard gripping his leg. Colton was descending from the high ground rifle across his back, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man whose part of the battle was finished. 3 brothers, 3 sets of amber eyes, all fixed on Malcolm Graves, who sat slumped against the cabin wall, with the ruins of his plans scattered around him like broken glass. But Graves was not finished. Even pinned against the wall, even surrounded by 3 men who could have ended him without breaking stride, Malcolm Graves retained the composure that had made him formidable in faculty meetings and boardrooms, and apparently in the business of theft and murder. Your father was a fool, he said to Clara. His voice was steady despite the wheeze in his breathing, where Boone's impact had cracked something in his chest. He sat on a fortune and chose to publish academic papers instead of claiming it. I offered him a partnership. He refused. He paused. His slate eyes moved across the 3 brothers and returned to Clara. His death was unnecessary, if he had simply been reasonable. Clara stood over the man who had destroyed her world. She was shaking, not with fear, with something much older and much more dangerous than fear. He refused because it was his discovery, she said, his work, his 3 summers in those mountains. You wanted to steal it, and when he said no, you had him murdered in his own parlor. A difference of perspective, Graves said, in the casualness of it, the sheer academic detachment with which he discussed the killing of a man who had trusted him was more obscene than any threat he could have made. Then Graves played his final card. Shoot me if you wish, he said, but I have already sent word to the authorities in Cheyenne. My associates in Boston have filed a legal claim asserting that Professor Whitmore's research was university property. Even if I die here today, Miss Whitmore, you will never register that mine without facing charges of theft. The courts will tie you up for years. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind stopped. Clara felt the blood drain from her face as the full scope of what Graves had done became clear. He had not relied on bullets alone. He had built a second front, a paper war, the kind of battle fought in courtrooms and offices where men like Graves had every advantage and women like Clara had none. Then she will fight it in court, Silas said. His voice cut through the silence like a blade through rope. With witnesses, with evidence, with a judge who is not in your pocket. Her uncle is Judge Russell Whitmore of Laramie. And your hired men out there, he gestured toward the clearing, will have quite a story to tell about who sent them and why. Colton bound Graves with rope. Boone secured the two wounded men outside, and Silas, bleeding from a graze on his upper arm that he treated with no more concern than a scratch from a branch, stood in the center of the ruined cabin and looked at Clara with eyes that held everything he had told her the night before and everything he had not yet found words for. Clara crossed to him. She took his injured arm in her hands gently, the way she had once handled instruments in a Boston hospital where she had volunteered during her studies. She cleaned the wound with water and bound it with cloth torn from a clean shirt, and her fingers were steady and sure despite the trembling that had not quite left her body. When she tied off the bandage, Silas caught her hand. He raised it to his lips and pressed a single kiss against her palm. Soft, reverent, the kind of kiss that said more than 1,000 words, because it came from a man who had spent more than a decade believing he would never touch another person with tenderness again. "Thank you," he said, and Clara understood that he was not thanking her for the bandage. The ride to Cottonwood the following day was quiet in the way that mornings are quiet after storms. The sky was scrubbed clean and impossibly blue. The mountains stood sharp and vivid against the horizon as though they had been freshly painted. Graves rode with his hands bound, his fine coat muddied. His silver composure finally cracked. The two wounded men had been loaded onto horses and tied to their saddles with the efficient indifference that Colton brought to all tasks involving people he considered beneath contempt. Hector Brannigan stood in the doorway of his mercantile and watched the procession arrive with eyebrows that climbed steadily toward his hairline. "Knew that fancy-dressed fellow was no good the moment he walked in here," he said, shaking his head. "Had the look of a man who would sell his own mother for the right price." The stage arrived on schedule the next morning. Clara stood on the boardwalk outside Brannigan's store with her carpet bag at her feet and the oilskin packets secure inside her bodice, and the weight of goodbye pressing down on her chest like a stone. 3 men stood before her, 3 sets of amber eyes. 3 different kinds of ache. Boone stepped forward first. His smile was in place, but his eyes were bright with moisture he did not try to hide. "Do not forget to come back and finish teaching me that Irish song," he said. "I have been murdering it every evening since you left the cabin and the horses are filing complaints." Clara embraced him. He held her tightly for a moment that lasted exactly long enough to say everything and not long enough by half, and then he stepped back, his jaw working, his hands shoving into his pockets as though he did not trust them to let her go otherwise. Colton came next. He stood rigid, uncertain, a man whose body could split firewood all day without tiring, but who did not know what to do with his arms when the task was tenderness. Clara extended her hand. He took it. Then, with a motion so sudden it surprised them both, he pulled her into an embrace that was brief and fierce, and strong enough to leave her breathless. "Come back safe," he said against her hair, his voice rough as unfinished timber. "Or I will ride to Laramie and drag you home myself." He released her and turned away. But not fast enough. Clara saw his face, and what she saw there was not the wall he had built after Sarah Calloway. It was the ruins of the wall, and behind it the man he had been before grief taught him to hide. Silas was last. He removed his hat. The morning sun caught his chestnut hair and lit the amber of his eyes and the small white scar above his brow. And Clara memorized every detail with the desperation of someone who knows that memory is the only thing that survives distance. 1 month, she said. "I will settle everything with my uncle and come back in 1 month." Silas nodded. "We will be here, all 3 of us, waiting." Clara rose on her toes and kissed him, brief and gentle there in front of Hector Brannigan and Mrs. Ada Finch and half of Cottonwood, and she did not care. Silas closed his eyes at the contact, and she felt the breath leave him in a long, slow exhale, as though he were letting go of something he had been holding for a very long time. She boarded the stage. Through the window, she watched three tall figures standing in a line on the boardwalk, hats in their hands, the morning light making giants of them against the small wooden buildings of a town that barely existed. They did not move. They did not wave. They simply stood and watched until the stage rounded the bend in the road and Cottonwood disappeared from view. The hardest part of Clara's journey was not the 3 days of travel to Laramie. It was not the jolting stage or the rough way stations or the dust that seeped into everything. The hardest part was the silence. For nearly a week, she had fallen asleep to the sound of footsteps circling the cabin, the crack of a fire someone else had built, the distant murmur of voices that meant she was not alone. Now the silence pressed against her like something physical, and she found herself reaching for sounds that were not there. The steady rhythm of Colton's boots on the porch, the soft melody of Boone's guitar through the cabin wall, the quality of stillness that meant Silas was nearby watching, present, without needing to announce himself. She used the hours to organize her thoughts and her evidence, reviewing her father's journal page by page, preparing the case she would make to her uncle. But in the quiet moments between way stations, her thoughts returned to a clearing in the mountains, and three men who had taught her in the space of a single week what it meant to be protected. Not as a possession, but as a person. Judge Russell Whitmore was a tall man with auburn hair, gone silver, and eyes that held the same sharp intelligence as his late brother. His shock at Clara's arrival turned to grief when she told him about Alistair, and then to cold fury when she described Graves and his machinations. The legal work moved swiftly, the journal written entirely in Alistair Whitmore's distinctive hand with dates and methodology and survey results that no collaborator could replicate, proved conclusively that the silver discovery was personal research. Graves's claim was demolished before it reached a courtroom. The two hired gunmen facing charges of their own provided testimony that sealed the professor's fate. Graves would face prosecution for conspiracy to commit murder, theft, and unlawful pursuit. The mining claim was registered in Clara's name as sole heir. Clara hired engineers and investors under her uncle's guidance, established a development plan for the mine, and signed the papers that would ensure her financial independence regardless of what came next. She was thorough and methodical, her father's daughter in every way that mattered. But each evening when the legal work was finished and the house grew quiet, she stood at her uncle's window and looked west toward mountains she could not see and ached with a loneliness that no amount of silver could fill. On her 18th night in Laramie, Judge Whitmore looked across the dinner table at his niece and said what both of them already knew. "You left your heart in Cottonwood." Clara did not deny it. The judge set down his fork. "Silas Vance," he said, and Clara startled at the name. "They called him the Ghost during the war. His name reached all the way to Washington, saved an entire company at Chancellorsville by running through enemy lines alone to deliver warning of an ambush." He studied Clara with eyes that missed nothing. "I would say you have chosen well, my dear." Clara absorbed this new information about the man she loved, a man who had never mentioned his heroism because he did not consider it heroism. He considered it survival. And now she understood that the quiet authority he carried, the absolute stillness that lived at his center, was not emptiness. It was the calm of a man who had looked at the worst the world could offer and chosen despite everything to keep standing. "Your mother chose love," the judge said gently. "When she left Ireland for your father, everyone told her she was mad. She came anyway. She came with nothing but courage and a heart full of certainty." He paused. "I have not seen that same certainty in anyone since. Until tonight." Before she boarded the westbound stage, her uncle pressed a small velvet pouch into her hand. "Open it later," he said. At a way station in the middle of nowhere, Clara opened the pouch and found a gold locket on a fine chain. Inside, a miniature portrait of her parents on their wedding day. Her mother radiant and brave. Her father beaming with a joy that leaped across decades. The note read, "Your mother wore this the day she married your father. May it bring you the same courage she had when she left Ireland for an unknown land in an uncertain future. With all my love, Uncle Russell." Clara fastened the locket around her neck and felt it settle against her chest, warm and light and full of blessing. She was going home, not to Boston, not to the life that had been mapped out for her by convention and expectation and a father's well-meaning fear. She was going home to a cabin in a clearing by a creek and to the man who had pulled her from the water and given her back her life. The stage arrived in Cottonwood on a Tuesday morning, exactly 4 weeks after Clara's departure. She climbed down before the driver could offer his hand, her eyes searching the boardwalk, the storefronts, the handful of people going about their business in the thin mountain air. She did not see them. The boardwalk was empty. Hector Brannigan stood in his doorway with an expression Clara could not read. Her heart, which had been pounding since the stage crested the last ridge, seized in her chest. Something had happened. They were hurt. They were gone. They had changed their minds. The 4 weeks had given them time to think, and thinking had led them to the rational conclusion that a woman from Boston with a murdered father and a silver mine and a trail of violence behind her was not worth the trouble she would bring. Then Hector smiled and nodded toward the far end of the street. 3 men walked out of the small white church, not in their hunting clothes, not in worn leather and trail dust. They wore new vests over clean white shirts, new trousers, boots that had been polished until they caught the sunlight. Their hair was trimmed. Their faces were shaved clean, all 3 of them, even Colton, who Clara had never seen without stubble. Silas stood in the center, his hat in his hands. Colton on his right, wearing an expression Clara had never seen on his face. Hope, undisguised and unhidden and trembling at the edges like a flame in wind. Boone on his left, grinning so wide his face could barely contain it, tears running freely down his cheeks without shame. Clara ran, not walked, not hurried. Ran her traveling dress, billowing behind her, the gold locket bouncing against her chest, her carpet bag abandoned in the dust where the stage had deposited it. She ran the length of that boardwalk and launched herself at Silas Vance, who caught her the way he had caught her in the creek, solid and sure and immovable, lifting her off the ground as though she weighed nothing at all. "You came back," he said against her hair, and his voice cracked on the last word in a way that told Clara the 4 weeks had been as long for him as they had been for her. "I promised," she whispered. "Did you doubt me?" "Not you. Never you. But I thought perhaps your uncle, the silver mine, the future that could be yours, might make more sense than this." He did not gesture at himself or the town. He did not need to. The question was in his eyes, and it was the only question that had ever mattered. Clara placed her hand against his chest over the heart that had beaten so strong beneath her palm on the last night before the battle. "The only future that makes sense to me is the one with you in it, Silas Vance. The mine, the money, none of it means anything without this. Without you. Without all of you. You are my family now." Boone wrapped his arms around them, both laughing and crying simultaneously. "So does this mean you will finish teaching me that Irish song?" Clara laughed through her own tears and reached for Colton. He stood 2 paces away, his throat working, his amber eyes red-rimmed, his big calloused hands hanging at his sides, as though he had forgotten what they were for. She took his hand and pulled him closer. "And you, Colton Vance, are you done pretending you do not care?" His fingers tightened around hers. He looked down at her hands, small and pale in his massive scarred grip, and when he looked up again, the wall was gone. All of it, every stone and every beam and every year of grief and isolation. "Been done pretending since the day you fell off that horse and laughed instead of cried," he said, his voice raw and broken and beautiful. "I knew right then. You were made for this life. For us." They were married 2 days later in the small white church where Clara had seen them waiting. Hector Brannigan walked her down the aisle. Mrs. Ada Finch served as witness and cried into a handkerchief the size of a dinner napkin. Colton and Boone flanked Silas at the altar, their amber eyes bright, their shoulders squared, looking for all the world like men standing guard even at a wedding. Silas slid a ring onto Clara's finger, a simple gold band with a small pearl at its center, warm from being carried in his vest pocket for weeks. "My mother's," he said. "I rode to Cheyenne to get it from the bank where I have kept it all these years. I went while you were in Laramie. I did not know if you would come back, but I wanted to be ready. That is what a good man does." Clara wore a blue dress from Brannigan's Mercantile and wildflowers in her hair and her mother's locket at her throat. When the circuit preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Silas kissed her gently, and in that single tender touch, Clara felt more than 10 years of solitude dissolve like snow in a spring creek. Mrs. Finch sobbed openly. Hector blew his nose with a sound like a steamboat whistle. Boone let out a whoop that startled the horses tied outside, and Colton smiled, a real smile and unguarded and free, the first Clara had seen that reached all the way to his eyes. The door of their cabin closed softly behind them that evening. Outside, the first stars appeared above the mountains, and the pines whispered in a wind that carried the scent of sage and coming winter. They had built this together. All of them, and it was only the beginning. The seasons turned, and the life they built together evolved in ways none of them could have predicted on that spring day by Cottonwood Creek. The first summer was a revelation. Clara discovered that the Wyoming wilderness, which had nearly killed her, was also capable of breathtaking generosity. Wildflowers blanketed the mountain meadows in waves of blue columbine and Indian paintbrush. The creek, no longer swollen with snowmelt, ran clear and gentle over smooth stones, and Clara could sit on the bank where she had nearly drowned and listen to the water and feel nothing but gratitude. Boone taught her to identify wild onions and sage and the dozens of plants that grew in the mountain soil, each one with its own use and its own story. His grandmother had been half Cherokee, he told her, and she had taught him to live off the land before he could read. Clara, whose education had consisted of literature and mathematics and French, found herself kneeling in the dirt beside a man twice her size, learning to read the earth the way she had once read books. Colton taught her to ride properly, not the side saddle posture of Boston society, but the practical balanced seat of a frontier woman who needed to cover ground and stay alive while doing it. He was a demanding teacher, impatient with mistakes, but quietly pleased when she improved. The day Clara galloped sentinel across the meadow without falling, Colton nodded once and said, "Not bad, Boston girl." From him, it was the equivalent of a standing ovation. And Silas taught her the mountains themselves, the names of the peaks and the passes between them, the patterns of weather that could turn a clear day deadly in an hour, the tracks of elk and deer and bear, the habits of each animal, the respect that living among them required. He spoke of the wilderness the way some men spoke of cathedrals, with reverence and wonder, in the quiet certainty that he was standing in the presence of something larger than himself. In the evenings, they gathered in the main cabin that was now Clara and Silas's home, and the space that had once felt barely adequate for one solitary man now overflowed with warmth and laughter and the comfortable noise of family. Boone cooked always. His venison stew had become a weekly ritual, but he expanded his repertoire as Clara shared recipes from her Boston childhood, adapting them with frontier ingredients and his own creative instincts. The results were not always successful, but even the failures provided entertainment. Colton brought his woodworking to the cabin some evenings, carving with a precision and artistry that surprised Clara the first time she saw it. His hands, which she had watched chop wood and clean rifles and bind a man with rope, could also shape a piece of pine into a figure so delicate it seemed impossible that the same fingers had produced it. He made Clara a small carved horse for her birthday, detailed down to the individual strands of the mane, and when she thanked him, he turned red to the ears and muttered something about it being nothing before retreating to his own cabin. Boone played his guitar and sang his bass voice, filling the cabin with old folk songs and hymns, and the occasional bawdy ballad that made Clara laugh and Colton groan, and Silas shake his head with the ghost of a smile. And Clara sang too, teaching Boone the Irish songs her mother had taught her, their voices blending in harmonies that seemed to belong to the mountains themselves. The first hard winter came with a ferocity that nothing in Clara's Boston experience had prepared her for. Snow fell for 3 days without stopping, burying the clearing under 4 feet of white, sealing the cabin doors, turning the world into a silent frozen wilderness where survival depended on the preparations they had made in the fall. Silas had spent weeks laying in firewood and preserving meat. Colton had reinforced the cabins against the worst the weather could deliver. Boone had stocked enough provisions to last until spring. They were ready. But readiness and endurance are different things, and the winter tested them in ways that strength alone could not answer. Clara was carrying their first child when the worst blizzard of the season struck. Silas, who had faced down armed men without flinching, who had walked through enemy territory in the dark without raising his pulse, became a man Clara barely recognized. He could not sit still. He checked the firewood supply 3 times a day. He asked Clara how she felt every hour until she told him gently but firmly that if he asked again, she would throw his copy of Marcus Aurelius into the snow. Colton rode through the blizzard to Cottonwood to fetch the midwife, a journey of 3 hours in snow that reached his horse's chest. He did not hesitate. He did not complain. He saddled up and rode out with the same grim determination he brought to everything. And when he returned with Mrs. Ada Finch bundled in blankets on the horse behind him, his eyebrows were frozen white, and his hands were so cold he could not unbuckle his own saddle. Boone met him at the door with hot coffee and a blanket, and Colton drank the coffee in one swallow and went back outside to tend the horses because the animals needed care, and because he could not bear to be inside while Clara labored. Boone stayed at Clara's side throughout boiling water and fetching clean cloth and telling stories in his warm, steady voice to distract her from the pain. He held her hand when the contractions came hardest, and his grip never wavered, and his smile never dimmed. And if his eyes were bright with tears that he refused to shed, Clara pretended not to notice. Their son arrived at dawn on a morning so cold the window panes were thick with frost, and the world outside was nothing but white. Silas held the baby in his arms with the trembling care of a man handling something more precious and more fragile than anything he had ever touched. His hands, which could split firewood all day, shook as he cradled the small, warm weight against his chest. They named him Alistair Russell Vance for Clara's father and her uncle. And when Silas looked down at his son's face and then up at Clara's, his amber eyes held something she had never seen there before. Not just love, not just tenderness, completion. The look of a man who had finally found the missing piece of a puzzle he had been assembling in the dark. Boone cried more than Clara did. He stood in the corner of the cabin trying to be quiet about it and failing utterly, his broad shoulders shaking, his big hand pressed against his face. Colton stood in the doorway, having come in from the cold at last, and his eyes were red and his jaw was set, and he did not trust himself to speak. But that night, after the midwife had been settled in Boone's cabin and the baby was sleeping and the fire was burning low, Clara looked out the window and saw Colton sitting on the porch in the freezing dark, his rifle across his knees, standing watch over this new life the way he had once stood watch over Clara's, protecting what mattered. That was who Colton Vance was underneath the wall and the grief and the gruff exterior. A guardian. A man whose love expressed itself not in words, but in the simple, stubborn act of standing between the people he cared about and the darkness beyond the firelight. Winter always ends. It was something Silas said often during those long, cold months, and Clara came to understand that he was not merely talking about the weather. He was talking about the war, about the years of emptiness that had followed, about the long season of isolation that had finally, against all odds, given way to spring. The mine prospered under Judge Whitmore's oversight. It provided enough income to expand their holdings to buy cattle to build a proper house on the ridge overlooking the valley where the original cabin stood. Clara used a portion of the money to establish a small school in Cottonwood, fulfilling a dream she had harbored since childhood. She taught the children of miners and settlers and ranchers to read and write and think the way her father had once taught her, with patience and passion, and the unshakable belief that education was the one gift no one could take away. Silas accepted a position as federal deputy marshal, a role that suited his talents and his temperament perfectly. His reputation as the ghost preceded him, and the men who might have caused trouble in the growing territory thought twice when they learned that Silas Vance was keeping the peace. He served for 12 years, earning the respect of lawmen and citizens alike before retiring to manage the ranch full-time. Colton found his peace in the land itself. He managed the ranch with the same methodical precision he had once applied to military operations, expanding the herd, improving the pastures, building fences and barns and outbuildings with his own hands. His woodworking evolved from a private hobby into something approaching art in frontier families. From 3 territories sent for Colton Vance furniture, each piece crafted with a care and attention to detail that seemed at odds with his rough exterior, but was, Clara knew, the truest expression of who he was. Boone opened a small restaurant in Cottonwood that became the heart of the community. He served the only proper Boston biscuits within 100 miles of recipe Clara had taught him during their first winter together, and his venison stew was legendary. But more than the food, people came to Boone's place for Boone himself, for his warmth and his laughter and his uncanny ability to make every person who walked through his door feel welcome and valued and known. Their daughter arrived 2 years after their son on a spring morning so mild the cabin door stood open and the sound of the creek drifted in on air that smelled of new growth and possibility. They named her Lily Sarah Vance, Lily for the wildflowers that covered the mountain meadows, Sarah for the girl Colton had loved and lost in Virginia, the girl whose memory had built the wall that Clara had finally broken through. When Clara told Colton the name they had chosen, the middle brother turned away. His massive shoulders shook. He did not make a sound. Boone crossed the room and placed his hand on his brother's back and held it there steady and warm until the shaking stopped. Silas watched from across the room, his amber eyes bright, and when Colton finally turned back, his face was wet and his expression was the most open and unguarded Clara had ever seen. "Thank you," he said. Just that. But the two words contained everything. The years accumulated the way snow accumulates on a mountain peak gradually, and then all at once, until Clara would sometimes stop in the middle of a task and realize with a start that a decade had passed, then another, and the young woman who had fallen from a wagon into Cottonwood Creek had become someone else entirely. Not a different person, a completed one. 19 years later, on a Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1895, Clara Vance stood at the edge of Cottonwood Creek and held her husband's hand. The water ran clear and cold over smooth stones, lower than it had been that spring day nearly 2 decades ago, when a broken wagon wheel sent a frightened girl from Boston tumbling into the current and into a life she never could have imagined. Silas was 53 now. His hair was silver at the temples, and he moved more slowly than he once had, though he still stood straight and still carried himself with the quiet authority that had never needed volume. Clara was 41, her auburn hair threaded with silver of its own, her hands toughened by years of frontier living, but still gentle when they touched the faces of her children and the man she had chosen over everything else the world had offered. Behind them, the ranch spread across the valley in the warm amber light of autumn. The original cabin still stood now, Colton's woodworking shop, where the middle brother crafted furniture with the same precision he had once applied to laying tripwires and calculating rifle trajectories. Boone's cabin had grown into a proper house with a garden that produced vegetables and herbs renowned throughout the territory. Their son, Alistair Russell Vance, was 18 and studying law in Laramie, tall as his father with his mother's cornflower blue eyes. He wrote letters home every week, and every week Silas read them aloud at the dinner table, with a pride he could not conceal no matter how he tried. Their daughter, Lily, Sarah 16 and fierce rode horses with her Uncle Colton, and managed ranch accounts with a mathematical precision that would have made her grandfather proud. Judge Russell Whitmore had passed 3 years prior peacefully in his sleep with Clara, so at his bedside. She had held his hand as the light left his eyes, the way she wished she could have held her father's. The judge's last words had been a quiet instruction to his housekeeper about the proper temperature for brewing tea, and Clara had laughed through her tears because it was so perfectly, impossibly him. In the clearing behind them, Colton knelt in the dirt, his arms steadying a 2-year-old child on the back of a patient old mare. Lily, Sarah's boy, with his mother's dark hair and a laugh that carried across the valley like church bells. The man who had sworn never to let anyone close again held that child with hands that could split oak, but cradled the small body as though it were made of blown glass. "Do you ever wonder?" Clara said, leaning her head against Silas's shoulder. "What would have happened if that wagon wheel had not hit that boulder? If I had made it to Laramie without ever meeting you." Silas was quiet for a time, his amber eyes still clear, still sharp, still the first thing she had seen when the creek water drained from her vision, all those years ago, gazed out across the water. "I think what is meant to be finds a way," he said finally. "If not here, then somewhere else down the trail." Clara pressed closer to him. The gold locket was warm against her skin, her parents smiling at each other inside it across a distance of decades. "I am glad it was here," she said. "I am glad it was you. All three of you. You caught me when I fell." Silas kissed the top of her head. "Best thing that creek ever did," he said, "was nearly drown a stubborn girl from Boston." From the cabin, the smell of Boone's cooking drifted on the evening air. Venison stew with wild herbs, cornbread in a cast iron pan. The same meal he had made the first night Clara stumbled into their lives dripping wet and terrified and carrying a dead man's secrets against her heart. He still made it every year on the anniversary, and every year it tasted like the beginning of everything. And beneath the clatter of pots and the crackle of the fire, the low, warm sound of Boone's voice singing the Irish folk song Clara had taught him 19 years ago, the one her mother used to sing, the one he had never once forgotten. They walked back toward the house, toward the smoke rising from the chimney, and the sound of a child's laughter and the golden light that poured from the windows across the autumn grass. Three brothers and the woman who had fallen from a wagon into a creek, and into a life that none of them had planned and all of them had needed. Clara remembered stepping off that stagecoach into nothing, Standing on a creek bank soaked and shaking, looking up at three pairs of amber eyes and not knowing that she was looking at home. 19 years later, she knew, she had always known. From the moment a hand closed around her collar and a voice said, "Not today," she had known. "You are home now," Silas said quietly as though he had heard her thoughts. The same words he had spoken on that first night, standing in the doorway of a cabin that smelled of sage and pine smoke, and the beginning of something neither of them had dared to name. You are home now, and she was.